The battle of proper names. But how is one to distinguish, in writing, between a man one mentions and a man one addresses? There really is an equivocation which would be eliminated by evocative mark essay on the origin of languages. Back now from Trees Tropiques to the essay on the origin of languages, from a writing lesson given to the writing lesson refused by the person who was ashamed to toy with the trifling matter of writing in a treatise on education. My question is perhaps better stated thus: do they say the same thing? Do they do the same thing? In that Trees Tropiques, which is at the same time the Confessions and a sort of supplement to the supplement au Voyage de Bougainville, *, the writing lesson marks an episode of what may be called the anthropological war, the essential confrontation that opens communication between peoples and cultures, even when that communication is not practiced under the banner of colonial or missionary oppression. The entire writing lesson is recounted in the tones of violence repressed or deferred, of violence sometimes veiled, but always oppressive and heavy. Its weight is felt in various places and various moments of the narrative, in Levi Strauss's account as in the relationship among individuals and among groups, among cultures, or within the same community. What can a relationship to writing signify in these diverse instances of violence? Penetration in the case of the Nambikura. The anthropologist's affection for those to whom he devoted one of his dissertations, La vie familiale et sociale de Indians Nambikura, 1948. Penetration, therefore, into the lost world of the Nambikura, the little bands of nomads, who are among the most genuinely primitive of the world's peoples on a territory the size of France, traversed by a picada, a crude trail whose track is not easily distinguished from the bush. Po 262, one should meditate upon all of the following together: writing as the possibility of the road and of difference, the history of writing and the history of the road, of the rupture, of the via rupta, of the path that is broken, beaten, fracta, of the space of reversibility and of repetition traced by the opening, the divergence from, and the violent spacing, of nature, of the natural, savage, salvage, forest. The Silva is savage, the via rupta is written, discerned, and inscribed violently as difference, as form imposed on the hile, in the forest, in wood as matter. It is difficult to imagine that access to the possibility of a road map is not at the same time access to writing. The territory of the Nambikura is crossed by the line of an autochthonic picada, but also by another line, this time imported, an abandoned telephone line obsolete from the day of its completion, which hung down from poles never replaced when they go to rot and tumble to the ground. Sometimes the termites attack them, and sometimes the Indians, who mistake the humming of the telegraph wires for the noise of bees on their way to the hive. Po 262 The Nambikura, whose tormenting and cruelty presumed or not are much feared by the personnel of the line, brought the observer back to what he might readily, though mistakenly, suppose to be the childhood of our race. Po 265 Levi Strauss describes the biological and cultural type of this population whose technology, economy, institutions, and structures of kinship, however primitive, give them of course a rightful place within humankind, so-called human society and the state of culture. They speak and prohibit incest. All were interrelated, for the Nambikura prefer to marry a niece, their sister's daughter, or a kinswoman of the kind which anthropologists call cross-cousin, the daughter of their father's sister, or their mother's brother. Po 26 Yet another reason for not allowing oneself to be taken in by appearances and for not believing that one sees here the childhood of our race, the structure of the language, and above all its usage. The Nambikura use several dialects and several systems according to situations. And here intervenes a phenomenon which may be crudely called linguistic and which will be of central interest to us. It has to do with the fact that we have not the means of interpreting beyond its general conditions of possibility, its a priori, whose factual and empirical costs as they open within this determined situation will escape us, and, moreover, call forth no question on the part of Levi Strauss, who merely notes them. This fact bears on what we have proposed about the essence or the energy of the Graphein as the originary effacement of the proper name. From the moment that the proper name is erased in a system, there is writing, there is a subject. From the moment that this obliteration of the proper is produced, that is to say from the first appearing of the proper and from the first dawn of language. This proposition is universal in essence and can be produced a priori. How one passes from this a priori to the determination of empirical facts is a question that one cannot answer in general here. First because, by definition, there is no general answer to a question of this form. The violence of the letter it is therefore such a fact that we encounter here. It does not involve the structural effacement of what we believe to be our proper names, it does not involve the obliteration that, paradoxically, constitutes the originary legibility of the very thing it erases, but of a prohibition heavily superimposed, in certain societies, upon the use of the proper name. They are not allowed to use proper names. Po 270, Levi Strauss observes. Before we consider this, let us note that this prohibition is necessarily derivative with regard to the constitutive erasure of the proper name in what I have called archie writing, within, that is, the play of difference. It is because the proper names are already no longer proper names, because their production is their obliteration, because the erasure and the imposition of the letter are originary, because they do not supervene upon a proper inscription. It is because the proper name has never been, as the unique appellation reserved for the presence of a unique being, anything but the original myth of a transparent legibility present under the obliteration. It is because the proper name was never possible except through its functioning within a classification and therefore within a system of differences, within a writing retaining the traces of difference, that the interdict was possible, could come into play, and, when the time came, as we shall see, could be transgressed, that is to say restored to the obliteration and the non-self-sameness non-proprietary at the origin. This is strictly in accord with one of Levi Strauss's intentions. In Universalization and Particularization, The Savage Mind, Chapter 6, it will be demonstrated that one never names, one classes someone else. Or one classes oneself. 6. A demonstration anchored in some examples of prohibitions that affect the use of proper names here and there. Undoubtedly one should carefully distinguish between the essential necessity of the disappearance of the proper name and the determined prohibition which can, contingently and ulteriorly, be added to it or articulated within it. Non-prohibition, as much as prohibition, presupposes fundamental obliteration. Non-prohibition, the consciousness or exhibition of the proper name, only makes up for or uncovers an essential and irremediable impropriety. When within consciousness, the name is called proper, it is already classified and is obliterated in being named. It is already no more than a so-called proper name. If writing is no longer understood in the narrow sense of linear and phonetic notation, it should be possible to say that all societies capable of producing, that is to say of obliterating, their proper names, and of bringing classificatory difference into play, practice writing in general. No reality or concept would therefore correspond to the expression society without writing. This expression is dependent on ethnocentric onerism, upon the vulgar, that is to say ethnocentric, misconception of writing. The scorn for writing, let us note in passing, accords quite happily with this ethnocentrism. The paradox is only apparent, one of those contradictions where a perfectly coherent desire is uttered and accomplished. By one and the same gesture, alphabetic, writing, servile instrument of a speech dreaming of its plenitude and its self-presence, is scorned and the dignity of writing is refused to non-alphabetic signs. We have perceived this gesture in Rousseau and in Saussure. The Nambiquor, the subject of a writing lesson, would therefore be one of these peoples without writing. They do not make use of what we commonly call writing. At least that is what Levi-Strauss tells us, that the Nambiquor could not write goes without saying. Po 288. This incapacity will be presently thought, within the ethico-political order, as an innocence and a non-violence interrupted by the forced entry of the West and the writing lesson. We shall be present at that scene in a little while. How can access to writing in general be refused to the Nambiquor except by determining writing according to a model? Later on we shall ask, confronting many passages in Levi-Strauss, up to what point it is legitimate not to call by the name of writing those few dots and zigzags on their calabashes, so briefly evoked in Tristes Tropiques. But above all, how can we deny the practice of writing in general to a society capable of obliterating the proper, that is to say a violent society? For writing, obliteration of the proper classed in the play of difference, is the originary violence itself, pure impossibility of the vocative mark, impossible purity of the mark of vocation. This equivocation, which Rousseau hoped would be eliminated by a vocative mark, cannot be effaced. For the existence of such a mark in any code of punctuation would not change the problem. The death of absolutely proper naming, recognizing in a language the other as pure other, invoking it as what it is the death of the pure idiom reserved for the unique. Anterior to the possibility of violence in the current and derivative sense, the sense used in a writing lesson, there is, as the space of its possibility, the violence of the archie writing, the violence of difference, of classification, and of the system of appellations. Before outlining the structure of this implication, let us read the scene of proper names, with another scene, that we shall shortly read. It is an indispensable preparation for the writing lesson. This scene is separated from the writing lesson by one chapter and another scene, family life. And it is described in chapter 26-3J on the line. The Nambiquora make no difficulties and are quite indifferent to the presence of the anthropologist with his notebooks and camera. But certain problems of language complicated matters. They are not allowed, for instance, to use proper names. To tell one from another we had to do as the men of the line do and agree with the Nambiquora on a set of nicknames which would serve for identification. Either Portuguese names like Julio, Jose Maria, Luisa, or sobriquets such as Lebra, hair, or Açúcar, sugar. I even knew one whom Rondon or one the violence of the letter II of his companions had nicknamed Cavanak on account of his little pointed beard, a rarity among Indians, most of whom have no hair on their faces. One day, when I was playing with a group of children, a little girl was struck by one of her comrades. She ran to me for protection and began to whisper something, a great secret, in my ear. As I did not understand I had to ask her to repeat it over and over again. Eventually her adversary found out what was going on, came up to me in a rage, and tried in her tongue to tell me what seemed to be another secret. After a little while I was able to get to the bottom of the incident. The first little girl was trying to tell me her enemy's name, and when the enemy found out what was going on she decided to tell me the other girl's name, by way of reprisal. Thenceforward it was easy enough, though not very scrupulous, to egg the children on, one against the other, till in time I knew all of their names. When this was completed and we were all, in a sense, one another's accomplices, I soon got them to give me the adults' names too. When this cabal was discovered the children were reprimanded and my sources of information dried up. 7 We cannot enter here into the difficulties of an empirical deduction of this prohibition, but we know a priori that the proper names whose interdiction and revelation Levi-Strauss describes here are not proper names. The expression proper name is improper, for the very reasons that the savage mind will recall. What the interdict is laid upon is the uttering of what functions as the proper name. And this function is consciousness itself. The proper name in the colloquial sense, in the sense of consciousness, is, I should say in truth were it not necessary to be wary of that phrase, 8 only a designation of appurtenance and a linguistico-social classification. The lifting of the interdict, the great game of denunciation and the great exhibition of the proper, let us note that we speak here of an act of war and there is much to say about the fact that it is little girls who open themselves to this game and these hostilities, does not consist in revealing proper names, but in tearing the veil hiding a classification and an appurtenance, the inscription within a system of linguistico-social differences. What the Nambiquora hid and the young girls lay bare through transgression, is no longer the absolute idioms, but already varieties of invested common names, abstracts if, as we read in The Savage Mind, p. 242, po 182j, systems of appellations also have their abstracts. The concept of the proper name, unproblematized as Levi-Strauss uses it in Tristes Tropiques, is therefore far from being simple and manageable. Consequently, the same may be said of the concepts of violence, ruse, perfidy, or oppression, that punctuate a writing lesson a little further on. We have already noted that violence here does not unexpectedly break in all at once, starting from an original innocence whose nakedness is surprised at the very moment that the secret of the so-called proper names is violated. The structure of violence is complex and its possibility writing no less so. There was in fact a first violence to be named. To name, to give names that it will on occasion be forbidden to pronounce, such is the originary violence of language which consists in inscribing within a difference, in classifying, in suspending the vocative absolute. To think the unique within the system, to inscribe it there, such is the gesture of the archie writing, archie violence, loss of the proper, of absolute proximity, of self-presence, in truth the loss of what has never taken place, of a self-presence which has never been given but only dreamed of and always already split, repeated, incapable of appearing to itself except in its own disappearance. Out of this archie violence, forbidden and therefore confirmed by a second violence that is reparatory, protective, instituting the moral, prescribing the concealment of writing and the effacement and obliteration of the so-called proper name which was already dividing the proper, a third violence can possibly emerge or not, an empirical possibility, within what is commonly called evil, war, indiscretion, rape, which consists of revealing by a fraction the so-called proper name. The originary violence which has severed the proper from its property and its self-sameness property. We could name a third violence of reflection, which denotes the native non-identity, classification as denaturation of the proper, and identity as the abstract moment of the concept. It is on this tertiary level, that of the empirical consciousness, that the common concept of violence, the system of the moral law and of transgression, whose possibility remains yet unthought, should no doubt be situated. The scene of proper names is written on this level, as will be later the writing lesson. This last violence is all the more complex in its structure because it refers at the same time to the two inferior levels of archie violence A and D of law. In effect, it reveals the first nomination which was already an expropriation, but it denotes also that which since then functioned as the proper, the so-called proper, substitute of the deferred proper, perceived by the social and moral consciousness as the proper, the reassuring seal of self-identity, the secret. Empirical violence, war in the colloquial sense, ruse and perfidy of little girls, apparent ruse and perfidy of little girls, for the anthropologist will prove them innocent by showing himself as the true and only culprit, ruse and perfidy of the Indian chief playing at the comedy of writing, apparent ruse and perfidy of the Indian chief borrowing all his resources from the Occidental intrusion, which Levi Strauss always thinks of as an accident. An accident occurring, in his view, upon a terrain of innocence, in a state of culture whose natural goodness had not yet been degraded. 92 pointers, seemingly anecdotal and belonging to the decor of the representation to come, support this hypothesis that the writing lesson will the violence of the letter confirm. They announce the great staging of the lesson and show to advantage the RT of the composition of this travelogue. In accordance with 18th century tradition, the anecdote, the page of confessions, the fragment from a journal are knowledgeably put in place, calculated for the purposes of a philosophical demonstration of the relationships between nature and society, ideal society and real society, most often between the other society and our society. What is the first pointer? The battle of proper names follows the arrival of the foreigner, and that is not surprising. It is born in the presence and even from the presence of the anthropologist who comes to disturb order and natural peace, the complicity which peacefully binds the good society to itself in its play. Not only have the people of the line imposed ridiculous sobriquets on the natives, obliging them to assume these intrinsically, hair, sugar, cavenac, build, it is the anthropological eruption which breaks the secret of the proper names and the innocent complicity governing the play of young girls. It is the anthropologist who violates a virginal space so accurately connoted by the scene of a game, and a game played by little girls. The mere presence of the foreigner, the mere fact of his having his eyes open, cannot not provoke a violation, the aside, the secret murmured in the ear, the successive movements of the stratagem, the acceleration, the precipitation, a certain increasing jubilation in the movement before the falling back which follows the consummated fault, when the sources have dried up, makes us think of a dance and a fate as much as of war. The mere presence of a spectator, then, is a violation. First, a pure violation, a silent and immobile foreigner attends a game of young girls. That one of them should have struck a comrade is not yet true violence. No integrity has been breached. Violence appears only at the moment when the intimacy of proper names can be opened to forced entry. And that is possible only at the moment when the space is shaped and reoriented by the glance of the foreigner. The eye of the other calls out the proper names, spells them out, and removes the prohibition that covered them. At first the anthropologist is satisfied merely to see a fixed glance and a mute presence. Then things get complicated, become more tortuous and labyrinthine, when he becomes a party to the play of the rupture of play, as he lends an ear and broaches a first complicity with the victim who is also the trickster. Finally, for what counts is the names of the adults, one could say the eponyms, and the secret is violated only in the place where the names are attributed. The ultimate denunciation can no longer do without the active intervention of the foreigner, who, moreover, claims to have intervened and accuses himself of it. He has seen, then heard, but, passive in the face of what he already knew he was provoking, he still waited to hear the master names. The violation was not consummated, the naked base of the proper was still reserved. As one cannot or rather must not incriminate the innocent young girls, the violation will be accomplished by the thenceforward active, perfidious, and rusing intrusion of the foreigner who, having seen and heard, is now going to excite the young girls, loosen their tongues, and get them to divulge the precious names, those of the adults. The dissertation tells us that only the adults possessed names that were proper to them, p. 39. With a bad conscience, to be sure, and with that pity which Rousseau said unites us with the most foreign of foreigners. Let us now reread the mea culpa, the confession of the anthropologist who assumes entire responsibility for a violation that has satisfied him. After giving one another away, the young girls gave away the adults. The first little girl was trying to tell me her enemy's name, and when the enemy found out what was going on she decided to tell me the other girl's name, by way of reprisal. Thenceforward it was easy enough, though not very scrupulous, to egg the children on, one against the other, till in time I knew all their names. When this was completed and we were all, in a sense, one another's accomplices, I soon got them to give me the adults' names 2po270. The true culprit will not be punished, and this gives to his fault the stamp of the irremediable. When this cabal was discovered the children were reprimanded and my sources of information dried up. One already suspects, and all Levi Strauss's writings would confirm it, that the critique of ethnocentrism, a theme so dear to the author of Tristes Tropiques, has most often the sole function of constituting the other as a model of original and natural goodness, of accusing and humiliating oneself, of exhibiting its being unacceptable in an anti-ethnocentric mirror. Rousseau would have taught the modern anthropologist this humility of one who knows he is unacceptable, this remorse that produces anthropology. Lo, that is at least what we are told in the Geneva lecture. In truth, I am not I, but the feeblest and humblest of others. Such is the discovery of the Confessions. Does the anthropologist write anything other than confessions? First in his own name, as I have shown, since it is the moving force of his vocation and his work, and in that very work, in the name of the society, which, through the activities of its emissary, the anthropologist, chooses for itself other societies, other civilizations, and precisely the weakest and most humble, but only to verify to what extent that first society is itself unacceptable, p. 24-5. Without speaking of the point of mastery thus gained by the person who conducts this operation at home, one rediscovers here a gesture inherited from the 18th century, from a certain 18th century at any rate, for even in that century a certain sporadic suspicion of such an exercise had already commenced. Non-European peoples were not only studied as the violence of the letter index to a hidden good nature, as a native soil recovered, of a 0 degree with reference to which one could outline the structure, the growth, and above all the degradation of our society and our culture. As always, this archaeology is also a teleology and an eschatology, the dream of a full and immediate presence closing history, the transparence and indivision of a parousia, the suppression of contradiction and difference. The anthropologist's mission, as Rousseau would have assigned it, is to work towards such an end. Possibly against the philosophy which alone would have sought to excite antagonisms between the self and the other. Let us not be accused here of forcing words and things. Let us rather read. It is again the Geneva lecture, but 100 similar passages may be found. The Rousseauist revolution, preforming and initiating the anthropological revolution, consists in refusing the expected identifications, whether that of a culture with that culture, or that of an individual, member of one culture, with a personage or a social function that the same culture wishes to impose upon him. In both cases the culture or the individual insists and the right to a free identification which can only be realized beyond man, an identification with all that lives and therefore suffers, and an identification which can also be realized short of the function or the person, with a yet unfashioned, but given, being. Then the self and the other, freed of an antagonism that only philosophy seeks to excite, recover their unity. An original alliance, at last renewed, permits them to found together the we against the him, against a society inimical to man, and which man finds himself all the more ready to challenge because Rousseau, by his example, teaches him how to elude the intolerable contradictions of civilized life. For if it is true that nature has expelled man, and that society persists in oppressing him, man can at least reverse the horns of the dilemma to his own advantage, and seek out the society of nature in order to meditate there upon the nature of society. This, it seems to me, is the indissoluble message of the social contract, the Lettres sur la botanique, and the Reveries. 12 A little glass of rum, which is a severe criticism of Diderot and a glorification of Rousseau, who of all the philosophes, came nearest to being an anthropologist, our master, our brother, great as has been our ingratitude toward him, and every page of this book could have been dedicated to him, had the object thus proffered not been unworthy of his great memory, concludes thus: the question to be solved is whether or not these evils are themselves inherent in that state of society. We must go beyond the evidence of the injustices or abuses to which the social order gives rise and discover the unshakable basis of human society. The diversified thinking of Levi Strauss would be impoverished if it were not emphatically recalled here that this goal and this motivation do not exhaust, though they do more than connote, the task of science. They mark it profoundly in its very content. I had promised a second pointer. The Nambicura, around whom the writing lesson will unfold its scene, among whom evil will insinuate itself with the intrusion of writing come from without, exothen, as the Phaedrus says, the Nambicura, who do not know how to write, are good, we are told. The Jesuits, the Protestant missionaries, the American anthropologists, the technicians on the line, who believe they perceive violence or hatred among the Nambicura are not only mistaken, they have probably projected their own wickedness upon them, and even provoked the evil that they then believed they saw or wished to perceive. Let us reread the end of chapter 1724J, entitled, Always with the Same Skill, Family Life. This passage immediately precedes a writing lesson and is, in a certain way, indispensable to it. Let us first confirm what goes without saying: if we subscribe to Levi Strauss's declarations about their innocence and goodness, their great sweetness of nature, the most authentic manifestations of human tenderness, etc., only by assigning them a totally derived, relative, and empirical place of legitimacy, regarding them as descriptions of the empirical affections of the subject of this chapter, the Nambicura, as well as the author, if then we subscribe to these descriptions only as empirical relation, it does not follow that we give credence to the moralizing descriptions of the American anthropologists' converse deploring of the hatred, surliness, and lack of civility of the natives. In fact, these two accounts are symmetrically opposed, they have the same dimensions, and arrange themselves around one and the same axis. After having cited a foreign colleague's publication, which is very severe toward the Nambicura for their complacency in the face of disease, their filthiness, wretchedness, and rudeness, their rancorous and distrustful character, Levi Strauss argues, when I myself had known them, the diseases introduced by white men had already decimated them, but there had not been, since Rondon's always humane endeavors, any attempt to enforce their submission. I should prefer to forget Mr. Oberg's harrowing description and remember the Nambicura as they appear in a page from my notebooks. I wrote it one night by the light of my pocket lamp, the campfires shine out in the darkened savannah. Around the hearth, which is their only protection from the cold, behind the flimsy screen of foliage and palm leaves which had been stuck into the ground where it will best break the force of wind and rain, beside the baskets filled with the pitiable objects which comprise all their earthly belongings, the Nambicura lie on the bare earth. Always they are haunted by the thought of other groups, as fearful and hostile as they are themselves, and when they lie entwined together, couple by couple, each looks to his mate for support and comfort and finds in the other a bulwark, the only one he knows, against the difficulties of every day and the meditative melancholia which from time to time overwhelms the Nambicura. The visitor who camps among the Indians for the first time cannot but feel anguish and pity at the sight of a people so totally disprovided the violence of the letter for, beaten down into the hostile earth, it would seem, by an implacable cataclysm, naked and shivering beside their guttering fires. He gropes his way among the bushes, avoiding where he can the hand, or the arm, or the torso that lies gleaming in the firelight. But this misery is enlivened by laughing whispers. Their embraces are those of couples possessed by a longing for a lost oneness, hail caresses are in no wise disturbed by the footfall of a stranger. In one and all there may be glimpsed a great sweetness of nature, a profound nonchalance, an animal satisfaction as ingenuous as it is charming, and, beneath all this, something that can be recognized as one of the most moving and authentic manifestations of human tenderness. Po 285. The writing lesson follows this description, which one may indeed read for what it claims, at the outset, to be, a page from my notebook scribbled one night in the light of a pocket lamp. It would be different if this moving painting were to belong to an anthropological discourse. However, it certainly sets up a premise, the goodness or innocence of the Nambicura indispensable to the subsequent demonstration of the conj ointment intrusion of violence and writing. Here a strict separation of the anthropological confession and the theoretical discussion of the anthropologist must be observed. The difference between empirical and essential must continue to assert its rights. We know that Levi Strauss has very harsh words for the philosophies that have made the mind aware of this distinction, and which are, for the most part, philosophies of consciousness, of the cogito in the Cartesian or Husserlian sense. Very harsh words also for l'essai sur les dons immédiats de la conscience, asterisk, which Levi Strauss reproaches his old teachers for having pondered too much instead of studying Saussure's course in general linguistics. 14 Now whatever one may finally think of philosophies thus incriminated or ridiculed, and of which I shall say nothing here except to note that only their ghosts, which sometimes haunt school manuals, selected extracts, or popular opinion, are evoked here, it should be recognized that the difference between empirical affect and the structure of essence was for them a major rule. Neither Descartes nor Husserl would ever have suggested that they considered an empirical modification of their relationship with the world or with others as scientific truth, nor the quality of an emotion as the premise of a syllogism. Never in the regularly does one pass from the phenomenologically irrefutable truth of I see yellow to the judgment the world is yellow. Let us not pursue this direction. Never, at any rate, would a rigorous philosopher of consciousness have been so quickly persuaded of the fundamental goodness and virginal innocence of the Nambicura mural on the strength of an empirical account. From the point of view of anthropological science, this conclusion is as surprising as the wicked American anthropologists might be distressing. Levi Strauss's word. Surprising, indeed, that this unconditional affirmation of the radical goodness of the Nambicura comes from the pen of an anthropologist who sets against the bloodless phantoms of the philosophers of consciousness and intuition, those who have been, if the beginning of Tristes Tropiques is to be believed, his only true masters, Marx and Freud. The thinkers assembled hastily at the beginning of that book under the banner of metaphysics, phenomenology, and existentialism would not be recognized in the lineaments ascribed to them. But it would be wrong to conclude that, conversely, Marx and Freud would have been satisfied by the theses written in their name and notably the chapters that interest us. They generally demanded to see proof when one spoke of great sweetness of nature, profound nonchalance, animal satisfaction as ingenuous as it is charming, and something that can be recognized as one of the most moving and authentic manifestations of human tenderness. They wanted to see proof and would undoubtedly not have understood what could possibly be referred to as the original alliance, later renewed, permitting the founding J together of the we against the him, already quoted, or as that regular and, as it were crystalline structure which the best preserved of primitive societies teach us is not antagonistic to the human condition, Lefon inaugural au Collège de France, p. 49, asterisk within this entire system of philosophical kinship and claims of genealogical filiations, not the least surprised might well be Rousseau. Had he not asked that he be allowed to live in peace with the philosophers of consciousness and of interior sentiment, in peace with that sensible cogito 15 with that interior voice which, he believed, never lied? To reconcile Rousseau, Marx, and Freud is a difficult task. Is it possible to make them agree among themselves in the systematic rigor of conceptuality?